Hello, we're working problem 21-1B. This is on page 932 of Financial and Managerial Accounting by Wild, Shaw, and Chiapetta. In this problem, we're going to be looking at variances. So one type of variance that we deal with is known as direct materials variances. And here we have two variances. One is the price variance, and another is the quantity variance. So notice that for price variance, we're going to be taking the actual price and we're going to subtract the standard price from it. And we're going to multiply these by quantities and try to determine if the variance is positive, in which case we would say it's unfavorable, or if it was negative, in which case we would say it's favorable. So picture that if we come back and say it's positive, we're saying the actual price is higher than our budgeted price. What we had to pay for the items, for the materials items, is higher than what we budgeted. On the other hand, if it's negative, what we had to pay was actually lower than what we budgeted, and we would consider that a good thing. Quantity variances are going to have us look at actual quantity and standard quantity. And we're going to subtract the standard from the actual. If that turns out positive, we're going to say it's unfavorable and that there are too many items used. If it's negative, we're going to say it's favorable and we had efficient usage of the items. We also often look at direct labor variances. Here we have two common variances, the rate variance and the efficiency variance. In the rate variance, we're going to compare the actual hours times the actual rate against the actual hours times the standard rate. So if this is positive, it's going to be unfavorable. It's going to show us that the actual rate, wage rate, was higher than what we budgeted. On the other hand, a negative would say the budgeted wage rate was higher than what we actually paid, and that was good. Then we'll also look at efficiency variances, and the efficiency variance is basically where we're going to take actual hours, multiply it by standard rate, and subtract from it standard hours by standard rate. Obviously, we're looking at the hours then. If it's positive, we're going to say that it's unfavorable because we used more hours than we budgeted. If it's negative, we're going to say it's favorable because we actually were more efficient and used less hours than we budgeted. We'll also look at total overhead variance, and here we have the controllable variance and the volume variance. With the controllable variance, we're going to start with actual total overhead and subtract applied total overhead. If it's positive, we're going to say it's unfavorable. Actual overhead was more than we applied. If it's negative, we're going to say it's favorable. We applied more than actual overhead that existed in this series of facts. For the volume variance, we're going to look at budgeted fixed overhead and compare it to applied fixed overhead. And if we subtract applied fixed overhead and find that it's positive, we're going to say it's unfavorable. Whereas if it turns out that the number is negative, we're going to say that it's favorable because we applied overhead to a greater extent than we budgeted for it. So we have some facts. These facts are particular to problem 21-1. First, the actual direct materials in our problem that we used were 1,000,000 units. The actual price we paid for each of the 1,000,000 units, and the units turn out to be pounds, was $4.25 a pound. The standard direct materials, our budgeted direct materials, are 1,050 pounds. Our budgeted price per unit is $4 a pound. Actual labor hours are 250,000 labor hours. Actual wage rate is $7.75 an hour. Standard labor hours are 252,000 hours. That's at a 70% capacity. And if you look at the book will show you other capacities, 80%, 100%, and you'll see that this problem calls for 70% of capacity. In other words, we might have budgeted what the cost would be at 70% of capacity, what they'd be at 80%, what they'd be at 100%, and we found that where we are in this case is 70%. Our standard wage rate, or our budgeted wage rate, is $8 an hour. There are a few more facts. Actual overhead fixed turned out to be 1,960,000. Actual variable turned out to be 1,200,000. Budgeted overhead, though, we were budgeting fixed overhead of 2,016,000, and we were budgeting variable overhead of 1,260,000. And again, we had several different budgets we could have looked at in the problem itself, and we were told in this set of facts that we operated at 70% of capacity. So we used the budget for 70% capacity. Now let's actually plug in some calculations. So first, we're going to be looking at the materials variances. And we're going to compare the price variance first, where we have actual quantity of 1,000,000. We talked about that on the last slide, that was actual quantity, times actual price of $4.25 per pound or per unit. So notice if you follow the arrow down here, this gives us $4,250,000 of actual cost. We're going to compare that to come up with a price variance to actual quantity, the same 1,000,000, but at standard price at $4 a pound. And notice if you follow this arrow, it turns out to be 4,000,000. So if we're comparing 4,250,000 of actual cost to 4,000,000 actual quantity but budgeted or standard price, we see that our price variance is $250,000 unfavorable. At this point, actual costs are higher than standard. Then we're going to do the quantity variance. And with the quantity variance, we start with the middle items. We start again with actual quantity times standard price. And when we multiply the two, we come to 4,000,000. But what we compare it to for the quantity variance is the standard quantity, which is different. The actual quantity was 1,000,000, but we budgeted a quantity of 1,050,000. And our budgeted or standard price was $4 per pound. This created a standard cost of $4,200, or 4,200,000. We compare it to 4,000,000, and we say that the $200,000 quantity variance is favorable. That is basically, since we're using standard price and multiplying it by actual quantity and standard quantity, that is, our actual quantity was more efficient than what we budgeted. So as we leave this screen, the price variance is unfavorable, paid a little bit more for the materials cost, but the quantity variance is favorable because we were able to use less pounds than we otherwise might have. So then to come up with a total materials variance, we look at the price variance, and it just comes from the last page. Last page we had 250,000 unfavorable for price variance. We had 200,000 favorable for quantity variance. And this leads us to a net unfavorable $50,000 material variance. This taken by itself is unfavorable, and the company should probably do things to try to improve particularly the price. The price it is paying for the units it's, or the pounds in this case, that it's buying of direct materials. Well, the next thing we need to do is come up with a direct labor variance. So the direct labor variance is going to measure actual rate and standard rate, and then it's going to measure actual hours and standard hours. So first we have the actual hours times the actual rate. Way back in the facts we said we had 250,000 hours, and our actual wage rate that we paid people was $7.75, a little bit higher than minimum wage. Again, each of those came from the fact. The actual hours times the standard rate, though, is the same 250,000 hours, except we budgeted a rate of $8. So the first actual hours times actual rate, we come down on the left arrow and reach a total of 1,937,500. The middle column, actual hours times standard rate, we come down and look at a budgeted cost of $2 million. And then in the third column, we have standard hours times standard rate, total budget, no actual numbers here. And we have 252,000 times $8, brings us to 2,016,000. So we're going to take those numbers over to the next page and plug them into variances to see if they're favorable or unfavorable. So first we have a rate variance. And in the rate variance, we're comparing the actual hours times standard rate to the actual hours at actual rate. And we've got 2 million minus 1,937,500. And this brings us to a rate variance of 62,500, favorable. There's a typographical error, I'll call it. Since it's a handwritten paper, calling it a typographical error is a little weird. But the arrow you see here should be coming down at a sort of a diagonal. The 2 million number is actual hours times standard rate, not, as the arrow seems to point now, actual hours at actual rate. So when we have the actual hours times standard rate of 2 million, and we're subtracting it from standard hours times standard rate, that turns out to be a favorable variance also of 16,000. In this case, we have a $16,000 favorable efficiency variance. So with regard to total labor then, we have a favorable variance. It's a $62,500 favorable rate variance plus a $16,000 favorable efficiency variance, brings us a $78,500 favorable total labor variance. And again, because the handwritten paper contradicts what I'm saying, I want to point out again and show you that The efficiency variance is standard hours times standard rate minus actual hours times standard rate. So we should have had a diagonal line pointing down from the 2 million at the top here to the second line here. So materials had a net unfavorable variance, indicating that we probably could get better prices or should aim for better prices on materials. The labor variances were all good, saying we had good efficient use of the workforce and we paid them efficiently. But now we can consider overhead variances. The third question that the problem asks is, what are the overhead variances? And so we're looking first at overhead controllable variance. Now here I'm reminding you that the problem says the company operated at 70% capacity. So we have actual overhead that was actually incurred, and we have the fixed factory part, which was $1,960,000. That was written back in the facts. We also have the variable factory overhead cost of $1,200,000. Then the budgeted overhead at 70% capacity, and again, the problem is written in your book has other capacities, 80, 100, and so on, but we learned that this business is operating at 70% capacity, so they budgeted for being perhaps at higher capacity, maybe even in one case lower capacity, 60% or something like that. This company actually operated at 70% capacity. So then we have fixed factory overhead, $2,016,000, variable factory overhead, $1,260,000. So our overhead controllable variance, the actual overhead is $3,160,000, just arrived at by taking the $1,960,000 fixed factory overhead plus the $1,200,000 variable factory overhead. We compared it to the budgeted numbers, $2,016,000 fixed factory overhead, $1,260,000 variable factory overhead budgeted, and our budgeted number is $3,276,000, while our actual number is $3,160,000. So this is saying that we budgeted for more overhead than we actually had. Therefore, we view it as an efficient thing that we come in $116,000 below budget on the controllable variance. So this is favorable. And then we look at the fixed overhead volume variance. Here, although we only came in at 70% capacity, we were budgeting or thinking as if we were going to come in at 80% capacity. So we budgeted at $2,016,000 fixed factory overhead, and you saw that on the last slide as well. But this is a budget based on us operating at 80% capacity. We couldn't get there, so the fixed overhead costs we actually applied were $1,764,000 and $2,016,000 minus $1,764,000 left a $252,000 unfavorable variance. So just to sum up the problem then, the variances were across the board. The materials variance turned out to be unfavorable in net form, and that implied to us that either our budgeting's off a little bit, or possibly we could push to get our prices lower. Somebody at budget time thought we were going to get better prices than we got for the materials. Maybe we can renegotiate. The labor variances were all good, said both our wage rate that we were paying and our